This is Red Podcast, episode number 237. I'm taking you behind the scenes when I interview somebody. How to get a great interview, that's coming up.
This is the Red Podcast. How to reach more people, establish your authority, and deliver your message. Here's your host, David Hooper.
I went to school for music. In 1991, I was a freshman at the University of Memphis. I was playing guitar, I had a band, and I wanted my music played, so I took a radio class, got a job at the campus radio station, with the thought that I was going to be able to play my music on the air. Doesn't work like that. For one, it's illegal, but also, the campus radio station, it was a jazz station. I wasn't playing jazz, but what I did get involved in was radio production and doing interviews. I've been doing interviews for a long time. Every week, I've got a syndicated radio show called Music Business Radio. And over the years, I've done hundreds of interviews. I don't do a lot of them here on Red Podcast, but because of the interviewing work that I've done over the years, I still get asked all the time, how do you have a great radio interview? That's what this episode is about. This is the Red Podcast, the podcast for experts. If you're a blogger, a speaker, an entrepreneur, a podcaster, somebody with a message to spread, this is the podcast for you. I'm going to help you spread that message, make people care about it, and make money while doing it. This podcast, it's about audience building. That's what Red stands for, how to reach, expand, and develop your audience. And that's what we're talking about on this episode, specifically by doing radio interviews. This episode is brought to you by createyourlist.com. You know, this is really embarrassing to admit, but when social media came along, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I thought email was dead. I was completely wrong. Email, still the number one way to market yourself online. If you don't have an email list, if your email list isn't as responsive as it should be, if your email list isn't as large as it should be, go to createyourlist.com. This resource shows you what is working now, how to reach people, and how to connect with them so they're going to respond to your message and also buy from you. CreateYourList.com to get this free resource now. As I just mentioned, I don't do a lot of interviews here on Red Podcast. And one of the reasons that I don't do that is because of the other show that I've got, Music Business Radio. When I started that show, and I started it in 2005, it's a syndicated show. It's on broadcast radio, coast to coast, as well as the internet. I did that show to increase the awareness of my music marketing company. But something that I found out was that if you only do interviews, you get known as a DJ. You get known as a radio host. You get known as the guy who's asking the questions of other people because they're the experts. Now, with that said, I think there is a time, there is a place for interviews. I'm going to show you the behind the scenes of how I do interviews here on Red. This is not an endorsement for you to do strictly interviews. I think interviews are great. I think they're entertaining. I think they're a great way to learn something. But if you're an expert, you're a blogger, you're a speaker, you're an author, you're an entrepreneur with a message to spread, it is important that you do not rely too heavily on interviews. You need to be doing solo shows. That's a topic that I'm going to be diving into on future episodes of Red Podcast. And if you're not subscribed, redpodcast.com in the top left will make sure that you do not miss these episodes about how to do solo podcasting. But on this episode, we're talking about how to do an interview. I'm going to take you behind the scenes on a couple of episodes that you may have heard. Red Podcast 233, Carrie Oberbrunner was my guest. We talked about how to make money with a book. And also my previous episode, Red Podcast 236, Alexandra Harbushka. We talked about her brand of bold marketing, how to be more bold, how to plant your flag and attract people that way. If you want those two episodes, the ones I'm referring to, for Carrie, it's redpodcast.com/233. For Alexandra, redpodcast.com/236. How did I get those interviews? There are two main ways that I get interviews for Red Podcast. One is via a request from the interviewee. And if you want to see my request form, go to redpodcast.com/guests. Feel free to swipe those questions and use it for your own interview database. That's basically a form that people fill out. Everything goes in a Google Doc, and when I'm looking for guests, I can go through that doc, review who's interested in being on the podcast, what they're pitching me in a very easy manner. What I did with both Carrie and Alexandra is I approached them. I was aware of them. I had recommendations from other people. With Alexandra, I was aware of her from a School of Podcasting interview that she did. And regardless of whether people are approaching me or I'm going to them, the first thing that I do before I make a request or before I respond is I look to see what it is that they've done elsewhere. One of the worst things that can happen to you is to have an appointment scheduled, to set up all your equipment, to go back and forth on emails, have somebody show up only to find that they're not able to deliver on their end of the bargain, which is giving you good content for a quality episode. Now, sometimes this is going to happen. This happens more often than I'd like to admit. It doesn't happen as often as it could, and as often as it happens to a lot of people because of what I'm going to talk about next, though. But just know that you can go through all of this work, and sometimes people have a bad day. Sometimes you're off. Sometimes things just don't work out like they should. You get a bad interview. I give bad interviews all the time. Like I said, I've done hundreds of interviews. Sometimes you still don't connect with somebody. Sometimes on the other end of the mic as an interviewee, sometimes you can't deliver. So it happens. And if that does happen to you, if you get somebody on and you're doing the interview, thank you very much, we're done, don't feel like you need to release it. In a situation like that, you've got two choices. One, tank the whole thing, ditch it. Or what you can do is sometimes you can take a piece of it and combine it with other pieces of other interviews and do a topical interview. So maybe there's one good spot, 95% of it wasn't so good. Well, take the good spot. Take that 5%. Work it into another episode. It's a little bit different from what you first had in mind, but it still allows you to have that person on your podcast in the best way possible. Look, it doesn't look good for them to be on your podcast with a bad interview either. So you're actually doing them a service. Sometimes it's an awkward conversation, though. Sometimes they don't get it. So if you get a bad interview, at the end of it, when you're doing your post-interview talk, just let the guy know, I'm going to go through this, use what I can, and I'll let you know when it's out. Done. If you look at my form, again, that's redpodcast.com/guests, you will see that I make people agree to a few qualifications. One of those qualifications is that I can use the content any way that I want. Another one is that I'm able to edit it any way that I want. The interview will be edited. Not might be, it absolutely will be. Because off the cuff, there's no such thing as a perfect interview. You're going to want to tighten it up, not only for your listener, but also to make the guest look good. So let's say you've done your research, you've approached the person has approached you, you feel like there may be some chemistry there. The next step is what I call a pre-interview. That's 15 minutes on the phone. I do this 95% of the time. I do it 100% of the time if I've never had that person in for an interview. I've seen some people get pissed about this. Facebook post, why you got me for a pre-interview? You're not trusting me to do my job? No, it's not that we're not trusting you, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page because I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to waste your time. A lot of times these people that approach you, they're coming in with an agenda. And you'll see that when you put up your guest form. They're coming in with an agenda. They've got a book to sell. They've got an app that they want to promote, something that they're looking to pitch. They're not necessarily interested in giving your audience the content that your audience wants. Pre-interview is going to make sure that you're on the same page. It's another way for you to let your guests know that this is what I'm expecting from you. That's basically what you're going to discuss. On my pre-interviews, I'm going to discuss my idea for the episode. You need to keep this in mind as a podcaster. You're in charge. They are not in charge. You are the host. They are the guest. You have your idea of how you want the episode to go, and it's good to be open. That's fine. You can take their ideas, but it's your show. You're the one who's in charge. You're the one who's responsible for making sure your listeners get a great show. So go in with your idea and come up with a hook. An example of that, if you heard the Alexandra interview, and if you haven't, redpodcast.com/236, she is not a marketing person. She is not talking about marketing, but she's got a marketing hook. I call it fly your flag. She's doing something very bold with her message and grabbing attention that way. That's something that you, as a Red Podcast listener, somebody with a blog, a podcast, a message to spread, you can learn from her. That's the hook. On the pre-interview, I'm also discussing equipment and going over that again. That's also asked on my guest form. One of the worst things that you can have happen is have a great guest. You're excited about the interview. Somebody who doesn't understand podcasting and quality of audio. I had a guy call me from a Starbucks one time on a speakerphone. Not good. You got the barista calling out orders. That's coming through. Kids crying. The guest has an awkward first date next to him. Not good. The guest needs to be in a quiet room. The guest needs to have good equipment. The pre-interview, that's another opportunity for you to explain that. The pre-interview and your final interview, how do you schedule it? There are a couple ways that I recommend. Both of them are automated scheduling tools. One of them is called Schedule Once. The other, Book Like a Boss. If you go to redpodcast.com/237, I'll have links of everything that I mentioned in the episode notes. Let's say that I've had a good pre-interview with a potential guest. We've gone over the hook. We've gone over equipment. We've gone over expectations. We've gone over the process. If it's a match, I schedule the full interview with one of those automated booking solutions. For Red Podcast, I need 20 to 30 minutes of content to get a good episode. To get that, I book an entire hour. My suggestion is however much content that you need for your podcast, you book twice as long. So if you need 15 minutes, book 30. If you need 30, book 60. You never know when somebody's going to be running late. You never know when there are going to be technical problems. Give yourself more time than you think. You don't want to have a rushed experience where you're having to get somebody in, build rapport quickly, and go away. Sometimes the best interviews, and this comes in the editing, they don't really warm up till a few minutes in. And if it's small talk or something that doesn't really work for the podcast, it's fine to do that, but edit that out. That's going to take time. So again, 20 to 30 minutes for me, I book an entire hour. I'm going to play you some clips from the day of the interview. This is the chatter that happens before we get to the actual interview. Also kind of a pre-interview. It's basically just to verify information. I'm going to verify the person's name, even if I know them. I'm going to verify contact information. Here's a clip I did with Carrie. This is right before the interview. Something that you'll also notice is that I'm also reminding him that I have the right to use and edit this content in any way that I want.
Everything may be edited. It may not be used.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you're giving me the right to do whatever I want with it by doing
Sure.
this. Okay. All right. So people get weird about that, man. So verify it's Carrie
Oberbrunner, like a runner.
Carrie Oberbrunner.
Exactly.
Oberbrunner.
Yeah.
All right. Make sure about that. And the website is...
So Elixir Project Book
Okay.
is basically where everything is. elixirprojectbook.com.
So that was me and Carrie Oberbrunner before we did our official interview. If you want to hear that, redpodcast.com/233 to hear the final product. Something I want to mention here is that this is where people get nervous. I've had some of the biggest rock stars in my studio. I've had presidents of record labels. I had the guy one time, he signed the Dixie Chicks. And I'll never forget this because we're hanging out, having a good time. And he looked at me. He said, David, you know, you're very intimidating. And I'm thinking, me? David? I'm just the radio guy. You're the guy who signed the Dixie Chicks, multimillionaire, a music business legend. And that's surprisingly something that you're going to run into is that people get nervous before you hit record. You're a podcaster. You do this all the time. Even a guy in the music industry, a guy who's in recording studios all the time. He's not necessarily the guy on the mic, and it makes him nervous. I can't tell you how many times I've been talking to somebody, everything's going great. We hit that red light to start recording. Starts fumbling, stuttering, stammering. People get nervous. One of the solutions to this is to let people know that it's okay to screw up. If you want to go even deeper, go ahead and screw up yourself. Mess up the intro, mispronounce a name, stumble over your words. And after you do that, say, now that you know I make mistakes, you're free to make as many as you want. It lowers the tension, and it's going to help you have a better interview. Something else to think about, because you do make mistakes, and the time to do this is when you're going over the name and the contact information, verifying that, is let your guest know that should you make a mistake, it's okay to stop you. It gets back to that intimidation factor. Sometimes when people come to your studio even the most successful people that you could possibly have in there, they're going to be intimidated because it's your domain. And if you mess something up, they're not necessarily going to correct you until the very end. After you're done, you'll hear something like, by the way, my name is actually blank. Here's how I handled this situation with Carrie Oberbrunner.
By the way, if I screw this up, which I probably will, just stop me, because like I said, obviously we're not going out live.
Sure.
And
sure.
It's better. It's better that you stop me then and I redo it than be like,
Totally.
By the way, it's Dumas. You ever seen that?
No, is that...
It's this commercial. He goes, I think I'm really dumbass material. I just can't wait to work for dumbass and dumbass, Mr. Dumbass. And then the guy's like, it's Dumas.
That is funny.
Elixir Project
Book.com.
Again, for the full interview, if you want to hear that, redpodcast.com/233. I did something very similar with Alexandra. I'm putting this here just to show you that every single time I do an interview, we have this conversation. It's Alexandra, not Alexandria. It's Alexandra.
Correct.
Harbushka?
Correct.
Okay, if I mess that up, I'm going to edit everything, okay? So if I
won't take it personally, don't worry.
Well, don't take it personally, but also just let me know right then. Be like, hey, dude.
Okay.
And then I'm going to re-record it. Podcast is called Life with Herpes. Is there like a subtitle or anything?
Breaking the stigma and removing the shame.
It's lifewithherpes.com.
Lifewithherpes.com.
One of the things that you need to be doing before an interview, and that's regardless of whether you're asking the questions or responding to them, you need to know who your audience is. On the interview that I did with Carrie, he took the lead on that. Here's what it sounded like.
I did go to iTunes. I did look at your stuff. And so basically your audience, your podcast is called Red.
Yep, right.
Yep.
At this time is for reach, expand, develop your audience. And specifically what I want to talk to you about is, I guess, doing that via self-publishing.
Sure.
People that are doing content marketing and want to expand what they're doing.
Sure.
One of the things that I casually mentioned earlier, I want to go into it a little bit deeper right now, is that people do not know the process. When I have people come into the radio studio for Music Business Radio, we sit them down on a couch in the business office. It's kind of like a lounge area. Give them a drink. It's just me, the producer, and the guest hanging out. And we explain the exact process. We say the show is in 4 segments. Here's how long the segments go. There are commercial breaks in between the segments. I'm going to take you down to the studio. I'm going to introduce you to our engineer. She's going to make you sound great. The producer is going to be signaling to me when we're in the studio. Pay no attention to him. Fully answer the question. Tell your stories. Do whatever you need to do to give us a good answer. If you go too long, we can always edit it. It's better for us to have too much from you than not enough. I do something similar when I do podcast interviews. This is, of course, via Skype if it's a remote interview. I did something similar with Alexandra. I didn't have a lot of time, so I let her know. I was using a different mic. I let her know that because that changed a few things up as far as how I was recording. I also want to make the note, because she's going to mention this here, you're going to hear this, is because of the pre-interview that I had done earlier, the situation didn't feel as rushed as it would have had I not done that. So this is an example of why that pre-interview is so important. Because when you get somebody on a Skype call, your schedule changes things around. You feel a little more rushed. That's not going to affect you as much as it would without the pre-interview.
I got another thing at 1, and I've got to actually go there. So I've got a hard stop about 12:45. Normally, I'd like to build rapport with you. Hey, how the kids? How you doing? But
we've done that.
Yeah, right? So we're going to go into it, and I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to try to, because I'm using a different mic on this, and I want it to sound congruent. I'm going to do intros, and I'm just letting you know that normally I don't do that. Normally I go ahead and I do just the interview, and then I float you in there. But now you're going to be doing it live with me.
Great.
No pressure.
Okay.
Something else you're going to want to do before you get a guest on for an interview is go over any rules that you have. This isn't such a big deal if you're doing a podcast or a radio show where everything is edited. But it can cause you more trouble because if somebody does something that you can't use, you've got to edit it, you've got to chop it, it takes more time to get it in the first place. Can you talk politics on your podcast? Can you use profanity on your podcast? That's the question that Alexandra asked me. Listen to how I answered that. Also listen to the way that I answered it so she didn't feel that I was judging her.
All right. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I've got a hard stop. I got another thing at 1, and I've got to actually go there. So I've got a hard stop about 12:45. Normally, I'd like to build rapport with you. Hey, how the kids? How you doing? But
we've done that.
Yeah, right. So we're going to go into it, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to, because I'm using a different mic on this, and I want it to sound congruent. I'm going to do intros, and I'm just letting you know that normally I don't do that. Normally, I go ahead and I do just the interview, and then I float you in there. But now you're going to be doing it live with me.
Great.
No pressure. You're good.
Okay. Can I cuss?
Yeah, I will edit it out. I mean, not edit it.
Okay, then I won't.
Well, no. Go ahead. I want you to be authentic, and I want you to do it. I do it too, but just so you know that it would be beeped.
Like I'm on the Howard Stern show or something.
Well, yeah, right. It's also like kind of like a wake up thing.
Never forget that you set the rules. But if that guest has an offering, if that guest has a website, if that guest has an app, a book, give him a plug. You don't have to go on and on about it, give it a hard sell, but let people know that the person you're interviewing has more available to them if they wish. People get weird about this, but I want you to keep this in mind. Your customer is also their customer. Their customer is also your customer. Let's say you're interested in dropping a few pounds. You're searching for podcasts about weight loss. If you're trying to improve on your fitness, chances are you're not going to stop at the first podcast you see. You're going to get 1, 2, 3, maybe half a dozen weight loss podcasts. You're not going to stop with the first book that you find about weight loss. You're going to read all the information that you can and find the best way to lose that weight. The majority of people do the same thing. And in various niches, we're all sharing the same customers. So don't worry about giving somebody a plug. Again, don't make it a long sales pitch. That's not why people are coming to you. They're coming to you for good information. But if they need more of that good information, go ahead and let them know where to find it. One more problem that you're going to run into, this happens especially with people who don't do a lot of podcast interviews. They just don't have the awareness to know what's going on in the background. And that's that there are things going on in the background, and that can affect audio quality. If you're not used to hearing yourself on the mic playing those recordings back, sometimes you don't know what else the mic is picking up. This is another reason that you want to do a little banter before you start recording. If you hear something and you think it's going to be a problem during the interview, you need to mention it now. The time not to mention it is when the person is in the middle of a thought. Here's an interesting clip because Alexander was completely on top of this. During our pre-interview, I noticed some papers rustling. I didn't think much about that because that usually goes away during the interview. But she had something else that was on her mind. Here's a clip about it.
I have a little space heater on. Can you hear it?
I hear a little rustling of paper.
Okay.
But
that was me with my notebook looking at our notes.
That's fine. Yeah, that's
okay. I'll just turn it off. We're good.
Those are a few of the main problems that you're going to run into before the interview. Let's say you go do the interview. Then what? What happens then? After the interview is done, stay on the line. A lot of people hang up. I can't believe it. So, all right, John, thanks for being on Red Podcast. Click. Just hangs up. You never hang up. And there's some good reasons for doing that. But one of them is if you've got a guest, don't make your guest feel cheap. Hey, thanks. Got what I wanted. Click. This is why you want to book more time than you actually need. 20 to 30-minute conversation. Book a little bit on the end. Make the guy feel like a person. Deepen that relationship with him. Let him know that you appreciated that he came on your podcast and gave you great information that your listeners are going to love. Now, I'm not saying you need to do this for an hour. Just a little bit, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, not too long. Regardless of the side of the mic that you're on, you never want somebody to feel that after an interview, the relationship was transactional. And here's another good reason to do this. At this point, your interviewee is all warmed up. And at this point, when the interview is over, he can loosen up a little bit. Sometimes that's when the best stuff happens. So keep recording, have that conversation. If you get some good stuff, mention it afterwards. Say, hey, listen, my tape was still rolling. Would you mind if I use some of this post-interview content, either to do a separate segment, maybe a subscribers only segment? Maybe it's great content that you can plug into the main interview. Most of the time people will say, yeah. I'm going to play a clip of my post-interview conversation with Alexandra. This is just us talking about podcasting. This is me seeing her as a peer. I'm glad to see different types of people other than white males doing podcasts.
Yeah.
Because God knows, man. I mean, it was a white male thing, and it was all about computers and Dungeons and Dragons and bullshit. Now we're seeing a little bit, we're seeing some depth. And I think that this, when I first started my book, I actually mentioned it, and I've had to change it up because so many more females are coming in to this. Again, for that full episode with Alexandra, redpodcast.com/236. A word of warning, that episode is not for kids, not for people who get uptight when you talk about adult matters such as sex. You've been warned. But if you're still interested, redpodcast.com/236. What then? What happens when you've got the content that you need? What then? Always edit it. Always. You want to make your guests sound as good as you can. You release it. You let the person know. That's a courtesy. Don't do that because you want the promotion. The only reasons the people that you interview will tell others about the interviews that they did with you are, one, they're egomaniacs. Those people will share anything. Two, because your podcast matters. That means it's a big show. That's something like Oprah, Larry King, The Tonight Show. If you were on one of those shows, you're going to let people know because those shows are big deals. Third reason, and this is why you edit, because you made somebody sound really good. So let them know. Your focus should always be on great content. If they promote it, great. If they don't, great. That's one of the things that people approach me all the time with, an offer to promote the show. Hey, we'll spend money on Facebook advertising. We'll let all our followers know all about you. That doesn't help me if it's not a good interview. The worst thing that you can do is have a show that doesn't meet your criteria, that doesn't meet your standards, and have it go out everywhere. Don't do it. Only good interviews rise to the top. They don't need promotion. They promote themselves. So let them know about it and move on to the next episode. Again, if you want to be a guest on Red, if you want to just look at my process for how I vet guests, go to redpodcast.com/guests. Feel free to swipe those questions that I asked for your podcast database form. If you've got any questions, reach out to me. @DavidHooper on Twitter is the way to do that. And if you want to make sure that you never miss an episode of Red Podcast, redpodcast.com, the top left. If you're on an iPhone, an Android, if you listen via the web, I've got a button for you to subscribe with just one click. It won't cost you a thing, and you will never miss an episode. Coming up next, Lewis Howes has a new book. It's called Mask of Masculinity. They sent me an advance copy. It's good. You might get some stuff out of it. I think as a marketer, though, you're going to be interested in what I've found, something that might help you. That's next on Red Podcast. Again, when you subscribe, you'll never miss an episode. So do that, redpodcast.com in the top left. Thank you so much for listening to Red Podcast. I'll see you on the next episode.
You've been listening to Red Podcast. Never miss an episode. Subscribe now with your iPhone, Android, or via RSS at redpodcast.com.